Dear followers, welcome back to the podcast of the FIB, the International Federation for Structural Concrete. This is episode number 3 of the Conceptual Design podcast series. For this occurrence, I traveled to Paris to interview Sony Devabhaktuni. Sony and I met at the School of Architecture, Civil and Environmental Engineering at the PFL in 2017. Later on, Sony continued his academic career and is currently an associate professor at the Department of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong. With a background in social sciences, Professor Devabhaktuni is interested in architecture's capacity to engage critically with political and economic concerns, both using tools such as drawing and writing. In this episode, we also discuss his new essay entitled Spaces of Protest and the People of Hong Kong, that will be available soon in the Public Culture Journal. And now, without any further delay, I welcome you to enjoy our conversation. And well, Sony, I will let you introduce yourself. Tell us where you come from, and maybe tell us what's the way that led you into architecture.
All right. Thanks, Patrick. It's really nice to have you here in Paris to have this conversation and, to talk about architecture. We haven't seen each other for, 5 years, so it's also nice to reconnect in this way. As Patrick mentioned, I'm assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong, assistant professor of design. I've been there almost 6 years, working in the Department of Architecture. And before that, I was teaching and practicing in France and also teaching in Switzerland. And I've kind of made my way through architecture mostly between teaching and writing and also doing projects, small, sometimes built projects. So it's not the maybe traditional way of having an office or working, for an agency and then, setting up your own practice. But I think maybe because of my background, before I did architecture, I studied English and political science. Maybe because of that background, I've always also been interested in other ways of thinking through architecture, not only with drawing and making, but with writing and reading, which is something that is a big part of what I do. So I came through architecture, you could say, even through reading about it more than actually having a desire to build, even though I've gained maybe that appreciation and also that kind of love for building through the practice of it. But I did come to architecture more through language and through words, which might seem like a strange thing, but
Yeah. I think indeed it is, because architecture is all about drawing and about building. What was the thing that connected with you and the reading and architecture? Like, what's the spark? Let's say that.
I guess when I was after I had done my undergraduate degree, I'd studied English and political science. I had always had an interest in architecture, but it seemed a little bit abstract to me, or a little bit distant from things that I loved doing when I was younger, which was reading and writing. I did have this appreciation for space and for materiality and for the way the built environment maybe brings people together, but it did seem very foreign to me as a way of, I don't know, as a practice, as a profession. I didn't know anyone who was an architect. It wasn't, certainly in my family, not something that was even considered like a job. coming from a place and a cultural background where architecture, didn't have that kind of status. So then, I think when I began to actually kind of read architects when they wrote about their projects, and when they began to talk about their ideas and talk about their built works in a way that began to articulate many more kind of circulations of not only ideas but values and ways of thinking about the world. I think it kind of set off something in my mind, and it made me think that perhaps I could enter into architecture through things that I was kind of familiar with, reading and writing, and begin to learn about those other aspects of the discipline, whether it was drawing or making things or building. So I think it was maybe this kind of recognition that there was this whole world of ideas that was circulating and kind of sparked within within an architectural intervention that just got me really excited.
Could you maybe make some example of those ideas?
I can actually name the moment when this happened. I was maybe 24 years old, and there was an exhibition at the MoMA of entries for the competition to do the MoMA expansion. So there were entries from Rem Koolhaas and Bernard Tschumi and a few others. So there were images and words, the language that the architects used to describe their text. And, I remember kind of, the images were interesting to me, but I was much more excited by how the architects talked about their projects. And especially in Rem Koolhaas's project, there was a real kind of critique of even the idea of the museum. And at the time I knew who he was, but I not in any kind of meaningful sense. But there was just something so kind of challenging in his way of kind of using writing, using language, using words to talk about the different challenges contemporary museums faced at the time, and the way he, imagined kind of rethinking all of those inherited understandings of what a museum could be through a spatial intervention, through a kind of taking apart of the institution. And, that sense that architecture could have an idea like that and then kind of manifest it through a spatial strategy was something that for me kind of was, it changed something in me. The fact that you could have ideas through space, have ideas through materiality, and that it wasn't just about kind of a pretty building. I think that somehow, made me really excited about studying architecture. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think that architecture kind of reflects society in that sense, and that many things we don't even notice or in our society are expressed through architecture, whether it's voluntarily or not?
Mm-hmm. I think it maybe good architecture reflects back a different idea of society, maybe, or a different idea of how relations could be, or for people coming together. And I guess I'm talking about, very simple things like the way you move through a building, or the way a building relates to a city, or the way that rooms are connected together in a house. All of these spatial adjacencies and relationships reflect back an idea of what a society or what a family or what a library or what knowledge can be, right?
Yeah.
So good architecture, I think, is always trying to propose a different way of bringing those things together, of articulating those sets of relations. So I think it does have that capacity to kind of think about society in ways that are projective, in ways that are offering alternatives or offering new models.
Yeah, this idea that you can move through a space or through a building makes me just think about this morning, because we got kind of lost.
Yeah.
In Paris, there are so many metro lines.
Yeah.
And I have the impression that this urban system is just, it's a good design if you know how to use it.
Yeah.
But it's a bad design when you just run into it. Whenever I come to Paris, I get lost in metro. And I know so many people that find themselves either taking the metro in the wrong direction or being on the wrong line, or thinking to go one way to catch, I don't know, line 4, and then instead they've gone the other way. That's really another level of challenge, because when you design one building, you're the master of that one building. But when you design a city, then it becomes even more difficult.
Yeah, no, I think that makes me think about first arriving in Hong Kong, which was a city I had never been to, and really kind of feeling like it was such a difficult city to navigate at the beginning, that I had at least no template for how to move through the city. And it was very kind of frustrating, and even sometimes crossing the street, because of the way the traffic is separated from pedestrians often, was a huge kind of frustration and challenge. And now, having been away from Paris from 2.5 years because of COVID, and coming back, one of kind of the things that really kind of struck me was how many places there are to cross the street. And, obviously the size of streets here is the scale of streets is very different, but even the fact that there are multiple indications, more than you need, crosswalks that allow you to even choose where to cross the street, is a huge difference from Hong Kong, where the separation is very strict, and you have one place where you can cross the street, and barriers that prevent you from jaywalking in many places. Not everywhere, but the sense that, how we move through the city is something that's kind of regulated, and something that's also kind of constructed by planning decisions, by the way we conceive of neighborhoods, by the relationship between the sidewalk and the street. This kind of became super apparent to me, kind of having lived in Hong Kong for a while. And I think it has an impact also on, as you said, kind of society, and how we, meet each other, how we move through neighborhoods, and how we are able to kind of interact together. So all of those planning decisions, if you want to call them that, or urban planning decisions, do have an implication for the social, I think. Yeah.
And I think Paris was completely replanned. Or basically it was demolished and rebuilt.
Haussmann's kind of replanning of Paris was an important part of the city's identity. It still is, but you could even say that that's happening today. There's a huge transformation that's taking place in Paris. Having been away for 2.5 years, it's kind of almost shocking to see how much has changed. From the very small scale of all of the bike networks that are through the city, and the way that's kind of depended on changes to sidewalks, curbs, bike lanes, dedicated bike lanes, traffic moving one way or the other, and all of these intense changes that really took place in the last 2.5 years. They were not here before. And I think part of that was something that happened over COVID. But then on a bigger scale, I feel like more and more people now live in the banlieue, the suburbs, and are connected to the city in ways that they weren't before, because of this project, which has been going on for now more than a decade, called Grand Paris, which is trying to link up all of the, to create a much larger idea of the city that links the suburbs to the center in a very different kind of way. Or I should say, actually, that links the suburbs to each other. So it's not so much about this kind of centralization that has always characterized the city. So that I feel like is transforming the city in super profound ways that are as consequential as what happened with Haussmann and that kind of reordering of urban space here.
Yeah, I have a question for you, because I have the feeling that this is the kind of transformation that many people living in other cities really would like to have. Mm-hmm. And they're waiting for government to make it for them, so they will have more bike lanes, mm-hmm. more walking spaces, more green spaces, and so on. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, you will always have people complaining that they can't use the car, they won't find a parking lot in the city, and so on. Mm-hmm. So often we talk about this problem. It's kind of a demand-induced problem, where maybe at first you have little demand or none, but once you actually build the bike lanes, people will actually go and use the bike, because it's much more efficient and it's probably faster and it's nicer also to go through the city with the bike.
Yeah.
Do you think it really works that way? Or do you think that people should... Why aren't governments taking this issue in many cities into hands and doing it like Paris? Or why did Paris wait for so long, for example?
That's a good question. I mean, I can only really speak in a way of kind of the history of what's happened here, which I know just by having lived through it in a way. In the sense that what really kind of changed things here was the introduction of this bike rental system called Valeri, which allowed or put bike stations all over the city, which meant that people could, with a simple card, pick up a bike and start riding it. When that was put into the place, there was no bike infrastructure. Riding through the city, there were, I don't remember any dedicated bike lanes when Valeri came into place. And it was a huge kind of experiment. But I think once people started using the bike, then slowly it created, as you're saying, a kind of demand or a habit, which wasn't there before, because there really wasn't that habit before. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there were very few people riding bikes in Paris. And I think the city government has really kind of been very aggressive about pushing that demand or making space for these alternative modes of transportation. At the same time, they haven't chosen other techniques of reducing automobile circulation. There is, for example, no tax to come into Paris, like there is into certain parts of London. And a lot of people are very critical of the fact that there still seem to be, because of where all of the cars have been kind of channeled into, there still seem to be certain acts or certain axes where you have real traffic jams and real problems with pollution. So there are huge possibilities for using a bike in Paris, but there's still other issues that seem not yet resolved. And I think all of this will take time, and people also need to kind of become comfortable with new habits of using the street with bikers, and now also with people on scooters and all kinds of different modes of circulation. And you could say it's a huge mess sometimes, certainly for pedestrians trying to cross the street. But I think those habits, as you see in some countries like Denmark or the Netherlands, where biking is, much more a way of life, and there seems to be more kind of the kind of rules or the norms of how you conduct yourself on a bike and share the road seem much more ingrained, and that still hasn't happened here yet. I think people are still learning.
But what's interesting is that actually the Netherlands, for example, they have also been very aggressive with their policy. It's just that it's many years ago, because before they also had cities infested by cars. Yeah. And then gradually they got rid of them. Yeah, that's right. And now everyone uses the example of the Netherlands. Yeah. But actually the Netherlands was just like here. Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. I mean, all of these, I've seen photos of the Netherlands where you do have cars on nearly every lane of the road. So I think in all of these instances, it has been a very aggressive policy that have made these transformations. Nothing is kind of a given or a kind of natural state. I think if the government really wants to change habits, it takes a long and aggressive sometimes work to do that, right? And a real will to make those changes, right? So earlier on, you were speaking about the suburbs, and this is a question that I don't know why, but it's kind of a cult now that I'm asking to every one of my guests. Yeah. Whether it would be better for a city to densify in height or to grow out in space or in plan, or whether it's dependent on the type of city. I think you, having lived in Hong Kong and knowing a lot of Paris, maybe you could elaborate on that. Because obviously when you have a lot of suburbs, you create this problem of connecting them all. Yeah. And you create the problem of, let's say, transport, first of all. But then you also will start to have multiple centers. Like if you're in Lausanne, which is a very small town, you just have one center. Yeah. And if you go shopping, you know where you go. On Saturday, you know that the market will be in the center. But when you start to have a very large city, then you will start to have multiple centers. Mm-hmm. And then maybe you will also kind of have, I don't know how to say it, but kind of ghettos. Mm. You will never leave the part of your city.
I guess maybe one thing that for me has always been really important to keep in mind is that there are very different kinds of densities, or density doesn't always look the same. In a way, Paris is a super, super dense city. Even Los Angeles is a very, very dense city because of the fact that they have, 4, 5, 6-story residential blocks almost everywhere, spread across this, vast horizontal distance. And Paris is super dense, right? So when we're thinking about Paris and Hong Kong, they're two very different kinds of density. And for me, I guess the question more is, how can you... These cities are historic kind of configurations of building that are now what they are. It would be very difficult, I think, politically in Paris to say all of a sudden that you're going to start building skyscrapers in the city. So the question in my mind is how do you really kind of work within the fabric and within the larger kind of metropolis to make sure that people in all different parts of it, whether they're in the center or the periphery, or have access to different kinds of services, have access to jobs, have access to green space, have possibilities for connectivity. So I think it's about, in my mind, working with what these cities are and trying not to use their, the way they are as an excuse for certain types of neglect, right? If we think of a place like Hong Kong, there's always this idea that it's a super dense city, and that's the only way it has to be, and that because of that, the public space is very limited. But I think it's often used as an excuse for not treating the public realm with more care, not treating the public realm as something that could be invested in and could be really expanded. So I it's a hard question. I don't have a perfect answer, but I think for me the trying to find within these different types of cities ways that work for the different types of people that live in them is the most important thing.
Yeah, because in Milan, for example, they've started building quite a few skyscrapers.
Yeah.
And it seems the trend now.
Yeah.
It seems the trend that it's coming. And at the same time, I think it's good to have a dense city so that you can have access to green space faster.
Yeah.
Because if we live closer together, maybe you can bring in more green space closer to this dense area.
Yeah, I mean that's in some ways what happens in Hong Kong, because part of the reason that you have the density that you have is that geologically or geographically, Hong Kong is often built in valleys and along coastlines that abut hillsides that rise very steeply, and where it's very difficult to build, right, or very expensive. So that almost anywhere you live in Hong Kong, if you walk for 15 minutes or take the metro for 15-20 minutes, you're in a green space, a country park. So one of the you could say trade-offs to the density of Hong Kong is that you do have a lot of nature right there with you. And in Paris, I think that is a big challenge, because when you look around at the different arrondissements or the neighborhoods, there are big inequalities on where you have access to green space. So that's also something to maybe think about as the city develops.
Could you maybe briefly tell us the story how Hong Kong developed in this kind of way, with the skyscrapers being there? And I guess in the beginning it was kind of a colonial port with low houses and maybe fishermen and tradesmen, and then at a certain point came Norman Foster and put its ASBC tower there. And
well, I think there have been pressures for growth and density in Hong Kong that arise from the fact that land has always seemed to be something that was scarce. Because there seemed to be so little buildable land, either along the shoreline or in valleys, that fact made land prices also go up. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that the land was really kind of controlled by the government. And the government, whether it was the colonial government or the government of the SAR, the current government, they, through leasing land, through creating land with landfills, they're the ones that determine when new land can be developed into skyscrapers, into housing blocks, into whatever. And they're also the ones that kind of plan out the infrastructural networks that will make farther away lands accessible. So that kind of control over land, and the fact that whenever they sell land or create land which they sell, they gain the money which allows them to keep taxes low, has always has meant that it's in their interest to maintain a certain scarcity of land, and because of that scarcity, it's meant that developers, when they do have a parcel, want to maximize their profit, and that's always been the driving force of development in Hong Kong, and I think it's led to the kind of supercharged density that's characterized the city over the past 40, 50 years. But you could argue that there are many parts of the territory, for example, the New Territories, which is the northern part of Hong Kong, almost near the Chinese border, where you have vast amounts of old farmland, which is controlled by different village clans, and there's a very kind of tricky political situation that prevents building from taking place. And much of that land is also owned by developers who hold on to it, and as a way to also keep land scarce. So there's this real strange kind of imbrication of all of these interests, which have led to Hong Kong being the way it is. And I think the fact that building on some of the land, which, for example, if you're building on a hillside and you have to, engineer a building into this landscape, has also meant that those engineering solutions have, because they're expensive, make it even more important to kind of maximize the profit, so build even taller, right?
Yeah. But so in this whole urbanism that they're controlling, they're not controlling the heights or the volume that you can build.
No,
is it just the footprint of the house itself?
There are also regulations for how tall they can build, but those haven't. I think it's the regulations for towers, for development, like much of Hong Kong, like many policies in Hong Kong are kind of oriented around less government intervention, or oriented around maximizing the kind of profit that the person investing in it could make. Because, for example, if a developer were only able to build it to a certain height, that land would automatically have less value, which would mean the price they pay to the government would then be less, meaning the government would make less of a profit from the sale.
I see.
So all of these things together mean that the government's own interest is in making sure that a developer can maximize their profits, because it adds value to the land and brings money into their own accounts, which allows them to keep taxes low.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, so I've read your essay, and I think it's really, really a high-level essay. Especially the English language was a bit overwhelming for me. So if you would give us a brief summary of your essay, that would be great, also for kind of the general public who is not so familiar with the Hong Kong situation since 2019.
All right, so thanks for reading it. I think I'm always impressed that someone would make it through the essay, actually. So it's not actually out yet. It's still in kind of the uncorrected proofs are up on the website. It's for a journal called Public Culture, and I co-wrote the essay with Joanna Ransbridge, who's now an associate professor at Chinese University in Hong Kong. And the title of the essay is "Democracy's Dislocation: Spaces of Protest and the People of Hong Kong." And another thing to know is we started writing this in December of 2019. So and we submitted it, I think, in May of 2020. So it's really 2.5 years ago that we wrote this essay. And for us, it was a way to kind of think through the protests and think through some of the discourse around the protests that was happening. Not only from kind of the media in Europe and the United States, but also some of the ways that Hong Kongers, that the people of Hong Kong discussed what they were kind of protesting for. And for us, there were three. The essays divided into three different kind of parts. The first one really thinks through the idea of what we call colonial collaboration and the relationship between China, Hong Kong, and the United Kingdom that has always kind of been a bit more entangled than maybe certain media accounts would imagine. So China's had always a huge stake in what's happened in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has always been, in a way, a place for other people to make money, whether it's Great Britain as a colonial power, China through that kind of collaboration, or even Europe and the United States. So that kind of history of Hong Kong is really this kind of threshold or entrepot meant that the most important thing to the history of the city was maintaining this notion of stability and prosperity. For Hong Kong to continue to be a conduit for monies between these different powers, there were all kinds of different, kind of soft authoritarian ways of governance that we describe that, go back to colonial times. And I think one of our arguments is that, democracy or democratic practices were never really part of Hong Kong when it was a colony, and even up to handover and even in the first part of its 50 years of transition. So democracy is something that's, there were very kind of meager efforts to set up democratic practices, but those I think we were always a bit skeptical of. So we go through that history and try to think about, what kind of, how that history was understood, or how that history was, played out in the protests and the way people talked about certain values like democracy, values like freedom. Or
I think this really made me think about Singapore, because for us Europeans, we want to have democratic elections, and we don't want our candidates to have business interests when they get elected. And in Singapore, it's completely the opposite. To be the mayor of Singapore, you need to be CEO of a multinational company that has at least a certain revenue.
Well, I think in some ways that's one thing we talk about also, is that Hong Kong's legislature was really organized as, and also this is a kind of leftover from colonial times, through what were called functional constituencies, which were voters who represented different financial or social interests. I think even architects had their own functional constituency and a voter who represented their interests. So many of these functional constituencies were business interests. So that the voting that was taking place over the past 25 years, the voting that was taking place was based on different business interests, kind of protecting their own kind of desires, or their own what was good for them. And that was how kind of democracy was articulated. There was a kind of introduction of representatives from geographic districts. But what happened was that even with that introduction, both the functional constituencies and the candidates or the representatives of geographic districts had to approve something, right? So it meant that nothing could get done if the business interests didn't also approve it.
Yes.
So it was an idea of democracy which was consensual, which meant that everyone had to agree, or if something was too radical, it would be put aside. And I guess that's another aspect of the essay, is this notion of we talk about some of the writing of Chantal Mouffe, who's a political theorist, who describes democracy not as this kind of rational consensual agreement where everyone kind of gets along, but really as a kind of agonistic, confrontation between very different worldviews and very different mindsets and very different desires. And for her, it's important that, despite this confrontation, that two sides acknowledge that the other one, has the kind of legitimacy to exist, right? And in Hong Kong, in the context of the protest, it's exactly that didn't exist, in the sense that the protesters and the CCP, in a way, would never acknowledge that the other one was a legitimate, actor, in a way. And that's, in some ways, what led to much of the impasse of the protests.
I think one phrase really catch my attention is that when you said that protesters maybe don't know what they're protesting about, it's just, or let's say better, they don't know what they want. They had 5, I think, basic things that they wanted, but really they were protesting about a missing goal in the future. And I think we feel that a lot in different societies, and very often when you have protests, that's a kind of the things people protest about, even though for you it might be one issue, and for me it might be another one. And these people coming together on the road, they had this was kind of the feeling that united them finally.
Yeah, in that sense, the 5 demands that the protesters made, I think, what we say is that those demands, in a sense, they knew that they would never be accepted, but it wasn't so much those demands that they weren't waiting for them to be accepted. What they were kind of protesting even more was just the kind of the contradictions implicit in the whole arrangement, the kind of impossibility of a future within the context of the government as it was articulated through the Hong Kong's relationship with the CCP, with the Communist Party. So I think it's that kind of that impasse, or those loggerheads, and the fact that it seemed to totally close down a future which they were kind of fighting against, in a way.
How did it end? I mean, when COVID hit, did it just stop this protest? Because nowadays we don't hear so much about it anymore.
You could say that COVID was a way to, was a way to kind of blanket over the protest. But more importantly than that, there was a law that was introduced in June of 2020 called the National Security Law, which the Hong Kong government had tried to pass a security law in the early, I think, 2012, but it was shelved again because it was too contentious. But after the protests, the CCP kind of came in and said, you need, the Hong Kong needed a national security law to prevent this type of contestation from taking place. And that national security law had many very ambiguous, you could say, had a lot of ambiguous wording that meant that many things that were free or possible before in Hong Kong are now things that will put you in jail immediately. So,
to make an example?
For example, during in 2020, in preparation for elections for the legislature, one thing that used to happen before was that all of the kind of left or democratic parties, because there were so many of them, they would not get enough votes to have their own people in the legislative council. So they got together, all of these different parties, and had a primary. And this primary was relatively well attended. People came and voted for it to try to choose the people who would be in the election. So the 40 or so people who were responsible for setting up this primary, which would seem to be a more or less, democratic way of handling something, the 40 of them are now all in prison. Because according to the national security law and the government, that was something that was trying to undermine the authority of the state, right? And not only that, but many protesters, many publications have also been shut down. Just 2 or 3 days ago, one of a 90-year-old Catholic cardinal, was put into prison along with 3 other people. One of them was a barrister, one of them was a pop singer, one of them was an academic, and they were jailed because they were the trustees of a fund that was put into place to help protesters with their legal fees and to pay for. So because of that, and that was seen under the national security law as being all these funds were seen as a sign of foreign collusion, right? Yeah. Because they said that money was coming from somewhere else. So you have all of these different ways in which civil society, press, institutions like universities, where the student governments are being shut down. All kinds of things, from the super symbolic to for example, this statue at my university was taken down several months ago. It was a statue commemorating Tiananmen Square, and it was taken down overnight, literally. So you have all kinds of things like this happening across the city.
That really sounds scary and crazy. And it reminds us how fast things can actually change.
Yeah, no, I think it has changed very fast. And because this has all taken place in the context of COVID, I think it's, been, there's this kind of double, this, on top of all these things, you have the apparatus that's been put into place that doesn't allow people to leave Hong Kong or come into Hong Kong because of this idea of COVID. So all of these things are kind of imbricated together to create a very difficult situation in the city, I think.
How is it now? Can you move freely to the city? Do you need to be afraid? Are there barricades?
I don't think, I think, do you need to be afraid? I think it really depends on many things. I think the people that were put into prison for various type of things, some of them have, pleaded guilty to the charges that they've been that they've been faced with, because they believe very strongly in what they were arguing for, what they were protesting for, right? So in that sense, they're not afraid of maintaining their own kind of idea of what Hong Kong and a democratic society could be. Moving through the city, I think Hong Kong is, Hong Kong has always kind of had a reputation for being safe and easy to get around and all these kinds of things. So, do you need to be afraid? It's I guess it's a difficult question.
I mean, from kind of a normal person, maybe tourist perspective, even.
Well, there are no tourists, because one of the things that's happened is that since certain point in 2020, Hong Kong has been, you can't come in if you don't have a residence card, right? And even if you are a resident, you have to do. It started out as a home quarantine, then became 7 days, I think, then became 21 days, and now has gone back to 7 days. So that's a 7-day hotel quarantine if you go into Hong Kong. So the only place with tougher quarantine restrictions is China, right? So that's made Hong Kong entirely cut off from the world for almost 2.5 years now. So it's that's also had a huge impact on the city with many people, both people who had moved to Hong Kong from other countries, but people who had were born and raised in Hong Kong, leaving the city. So it's really a radical kind of transformation of the city's very kind of population, if we want to talk even in demographic terms. And
especially for a city that's open and needs to be open in order to push exchanges and have this kind of mindset in order to keep the businesses going.
Yeah, I mean, there's the typical kind of identity of Hong Kong as a global city, as a city of kind of flows of people moving in and out. That idea of the city in the past 2.5 years has been totally cut off in some ways. I mean, I guess virtually money can, move freely in whatever way it wants. But that notion of Hong Kong as an open city where you can come and go, which really did characterize at least my experience of it. I think it's no longer that way, and I don't know that it can ever be that way again. At least not in the near future.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's kind of scary.
Well, there's just kind of a sadness to it, because there was a sense of Hong Kong being a part of the world in a very exciting way, and really a city that was connected to the world, and I think that's one of the things that drew me to it. And it's sad that that's changed so quickly and so radically.
Yeah, one of the things you were talking about also in your essay, which I really liked, was this new term I never came across. It's junk spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And I have often been kind of in different shopping malls where you don't feel where you are.
Mm-hmm.
You are in this kind of it doesn't really have an identity.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have a culture. It's just there for business purposes. It's not related in any way with its surroundings or with the culture where it stands. And I really like this term junk space because that's what I was looking for years in order to describe.
Well, this is for architects who might be listening, this is a term that Rem Koolhaas made very, very, very famous in essays that he wrote, an essay called Junk Space, which was in the journal October and which was also published in other places. It's a really amazing essay because it's like one long stream of consciousness paragraph about these spaces that he, I think, as an architect, writing in the 1990s, I think the text is from that period. As an architect at the time, he was also traveling all over the world through airports, through hotels, through train stations, and it's this idea of that kind of genericness of space that happens that he was experiencing. So I let's see. No, it's from 2000. Yeah, the original essay. So it's and I think it still describes well the spaces of much of the built environment, the environment that we move through when we're traveling, when we're going shopping, when we're doing all kinds of things that are part of urban life somehow.
And I mean, it's universal.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what makes it so interesting, because you have it in your essay, and you use it to describe these spaces, these shopping malls that you have in Hong Kong, and then you go from one shopping mall to the other shopping mall with a stair from an automatic staircase elevator, and you probably move through tubes because outside it's too hot, maybe, and you never get in contact with nature, and nature stays out. It's something bad. And there was this really famous book from, also around this time, maybe the early 2000s, and it was about Hong Kong, and it called City Without Ground. And the idea of the book was really about, Hong Kong is a kind of huge junk space where you had all of these three-dimensional circulations that allowed you to move through the city without ever touching the ground. And for me, when I got to Hong Kong, it was a little bit, it's true that the city, you can experience it that way, but I was also shocked that actually the ground is really important. The ground is actually something that as you move through the city, or as you kind of, imagine what the city could be, it's where that imagination takes place. And for the protests, for the, all that happened in 2019, the ground or the street were hugely, those were often the sites of the different types of contestation. Even though they also did move into junk spaces, they did move into shopping malls and train stations and airplanes, and protesters did actually take apart those spaces at the same time that they took apart the street. But I think one thing that the protests did was really challenge that notion of Hong Kong as this kind of continuous. They didn't challenge the notion; they challenged even that flow, or that circulation of bodies, of capital, of security. They kind of cut it off in a way that said, is this really what we want from the city? Is this they didn't want to sustain it. But I think the street was also a big part of that. I don't think Hong Kong can be kind of reduced to the circulations of junk space that some analysts have made in the past. Yeah, but it's interesting because these kind of spaces, you have them everywhere, and you have them here in France, and you have them in the United States. And they all look the same.
I mean, that was, I think, Koolhaas's point, that whether you're in Dubai or Hong Kong or Kuala Lumpur or Paris or London, that these spaces all have a kind of continuity. And it was really, at the time he was writing, and much of the early part of the 2000s, this idea of globalization and junk space had a big impact on maybe how architects thought about the built environment and their capacity or incapacity to kind of push against the forces of capital and consumerism that were creating these junk spaces, right? Koolhaas would almost, I think, say that you can't do anything to counter them, that those are the spaces that you have to submit to in a way.
I guess so. They're so practical. I mean, you just drive there with your car and you have all different kinds of facilities.
Also, yeah.
You can even go to the cinema.
Yeah, you can do everything. You can have an entire city within those spaces.
So, I mean, the only building I know in Hong Kong is the HSBC Tower.
Yeah.
And that's only because I went to the Norman Foster Foundation in Madrid. What I would like to recommend to everyone, because it's really amazing. You have all his little books of drawings, and there's this archive of all these books, and I don't know how a single man can draw so much in a lifespan. That's just amazing. The man who is responsible for the Norman Foster Foundation was a close collaborator with him, and he told me that he is actually drawing all the time. You take him anywhere he's just drawing nonstop in the helicopter, in the hotel, just everywhere. So that's also kind of blew my mind. So because you have this image of this man, and you think, okay, is he an alien or what?
Well, one of my favorite things about the HSBC building is that, and there are different stories as to why this is, but the entire ground floor is open to the street behind it and the street in front of it. So almost the entire ground floor is really just a big plaza. I mean, obviously, there's 2 escalators that take you up into the bank itself. And on weekends, on Sundays, foreign domestic workers, many of them from the Philippines or Indonesia, use that space to gather. So it becomes this very public kind of space. And it's a way of kind of really opening up a very private building, which was, a kind of symbol of capital and finance, and giving that space in a very small way back to the public realm. And I think it suggests an idea for what you could do with many buildings like this.
Do you think this is unique, or do you find that in other buildings as well?
No, you have it's unique in Hong Kong. I think I don't know any other kind of bank building that is so aggressively open to the public in that way.
Because in Milan we have the Unicredit Tower, and you cannot enter the building, but I must say that the square that they built in front of the tower, it's extremely popular. And they have this fountain, and I don't know, there are like 5 or 10 centimeters of water, and then you have children playing in the water, and there are nice cafes around it. And
no, I mean, I think. What makes the HSBC building is that on this very small footprint, they found a way to make a public square, right? If you look at a building like the Seagram's building in New York, or here in Paris, the Centre Pompidou, and the plazas that are in front of them, and the way that they kind of give back to the public realm, I think those are huge kind of urban projects in a way, because they make the city in very important ways. In the Centre Pompidou, actually, the plaza that slopes down to greet it, you could before just go straight into the building from that plaza. So it was really, and up the entire ground floor was just public. So before, that was originally how it was conceived. And that notion of architecture, which is so integrated into the public, so there's really no, even speaking of public and private doesn't really make sense in so much anymore. I think nowadays it's much harder to find projects that will do that. Even the HSBC building, sometimes because of COVID and because of the protests, at certain points they actually closed off that plaza. And I think it shows in a way the kind of fragility of that, what it gives, and how quickly they can take it back, because it is, theirs. But when it is open, and when you can walk from one side to the other through that space, and you see people doing whatever they want to do in that space, it becomes a really exciting thing, I think.
Do you think that other architecture inspired themselves from this building within Hong Kong, or maybe even abroad?
That's a good question. Now, I've always wanted to do just a studio on just that building, and trying to take that idea and transform buildings all throughout Hong Kong with that idea. Because I don't think, I can't think of any other building in Hong Kong where you so radically kind of give over, private space to the public realm. You have what's much, much more common all over Hong Kong, as in New York, is that you have these little, squares or plazas, which are created so that the developer can get extra air rights, can build taller, right? Can get extra floor space. and usually, oftentimes these plazas are, kind of awkward corners, or they might be up a set of stairs and really hard to find, or they might have, very tactically placed landscaping that makes it really hard to be comfortable. So, what usually happens is, or they might be heavily regulated. So a security person might come and tell you that you can't sit there or you can't do a certain thing. So it's usually that you find, rather than the kind of, space that you have at the HSBC Tower. So I think that's what makes it even more remarkable, is how generous it is in that way.
In Lausanne, we are right now. We are working on a 80-meter high-rise building, which is close to Malais. Just where there was the Galicien. It is you have in Malais. You have these arches. Yeah. It's just behind it. Okay. And it's nice because it's all a timber project. Wow. So it has a concrete core, but then it has all timber floors and timber columns. Yeah. So it's supposed to be like kind of the ecological.
And it's very open to the public in a way.
There are different levels. Yeah. So it makes the building really like kind of a multi-purpose building. I think you have only the last 5 or 10 floors are residential. Yeah. And then you would have a hotel, co-working spaces, and the restaurants. Yeah.
No, I think oftentimes in projects these days, even developer projects, there is at the beginning this at least a kind of the way they sell it to the government or to the public. There is a kind of discourse of being open to the public or giving back to the public or having green spaces, and oftentimes that discourse really falls flat when you get to the reality of the building, and I think it's I think it's a real kind of problem, and it goes back to the question of density that you talked about earlier. In a way, I think if we want to densify, I think it has to be in ways that reconceive, the nature of private development and public and private space, because any development that doesn't kind of give back somehow to the public realm, I think, is going to be, should maybe be questioned, especially if it's if it's a large scale project, and if it is going to be kind of is going to involve such a huge energetic or a huge amount of energy to build it.
And that's what makes you feel that our living space in Paris are so sustainable, because when you walk down the street, I mean, I think I never saw so many restaurants one next to the other. It's
yeah, no, I think that model of urbanism is there is something to what it creates in terms of a civic life when you have this real mix of activities and people and spaces all happening next to you, and all happening down the stairs. And many cities are not like that anymore, and and probably won't be able to be. And I think it's important to maybe figure out how to find other models of civicness that allow that aren't just going to the shopping mall and having
Do you think that designing a city from scratch is that an error that should never be made again? Like, if we take the Brazilian example, when you go to Brasilia, when they built it all for cars, and in such a way that you need cars to go through it. And now it's kind of, we say, okay, cars are not, we don't want so many cars anymore. We want more to go by bicycle, use public transport and so on. So we found ourselves in a situation where we kind of made a bad choice in the past, and it's very difficult to come back. Whereas something like Paris, it builds throughout the centuries, and then you have finally a product that it's much more flexible.
No, I think I've actually, for the past 5 years, I guess, I've also been working on a city in India that was planned to be for 3.2 million people, and they started work on it in 2015, and then in 2019 they had to stop because of a change in government. The new government essentially stopped the project, and so it would have been a city from scratch, or a new city. And obviously these are also happening in other parts of China, and other parts of India, and other parts of Southeast Asia.
This is not very familiar for those listening and have a European culture. We are not
Yeah.
at all familiar with this kind of procedure.
In Europe, I think, there were, in France and other parts of Europe, there were cities or suburbs that were built, from scratch, at least in the 1960s and 70s. Right? I guess, it's my own take on that would be that rather than thinking about a new city as a top-down kind of planning, that it should be really a kind of process-driven idea of what it means to imagine contingencies, right? Imagine all of the, as you said, all of the things that could happen, and how a city, as you developed it, could be flexible enough to change and to move into alternative modes of structuring itself, right? So that rather than saying, okay, this is the plan and we're going to build it in 30 years, you could imagine that you start with something that allows a certain flexibility to take different options, right? Because the future is never something that we know for certain, and everything is changing in such radical ways all the time that if you don't plan for those contingencies, I think any kind of project for a new city is doomed to becoming irrelevant. So you have to, as an architect or urbanist, I think through that idea of contingency, kind of build it into your model or planning to allow for multiple scenarios to be made possible, right?
Yeah, that's so difficult because on one hand you want stability, you want the stability for the people who live there, and you kind of want to stability of the place, and on the other hand you want it to be flexible and to adapt for different situations. I think those are two concurrent demands.
Well, I'm not. I think kind of maybe this notion that stability and flexibility are necessarily opposed. I'm not entirely sure about that, in the sense that for communities that were living in a place, they what needs to be stable is their capacity, I guess, to kind of live there, to make a living, to raise a family, to do the kinds of things they want to do. And if that capacity is tied to one very fixed notion of the future, then I think that actually isn't so stable. I think that actually becomes a lot more risky in some ways. But if that capacity is tied to alternatives of how things could be, right? If it's I
think I understand what you mean. It's like if you're not flexible, you can never be stable, because we won't be able to adapt to the upcoming situation that you cannot predict.
I think that's right. I think actually, imagining a stable, fixed kind of future actually always gets us into trouble. I mean, certainly these past months have shown us that. Right?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, it was great talking. I hope it was...
Yeah, it was a pleasure.